The witch's curse. The air was heavy with a sense of foreboding as I walked beside my father, the rhythmic crunch of our steps on the gravel path the only sound breaking the silence. Around us, a somber procession of mourners moved in unison, heads bowed and faces etched with sorrow. At the center of the group, a young man with trembling hands carried a simple wooden coffin. His shoulders sagged under its weight, though it was not the coffin that burdened him, but the grief that clung to him like a shroud. The cemetery loomed ahead, a collection of weathered tombstones bathed in the pale glow of an overcast sky. Trees with skeletal branches lined the path, their twisted forms casting shadows that seemed to writhe and shift with a life of their own. As we neared the open grave, the mourners spread out in a loose circle, their collective breaths hanging in the frigid air like ghostly whispers. The priest began his solemn intonation, the words weaving a tapestry of mourning and remembrance. I couldn't take my eyes off the young man, who stood motionless at the head of the coffin. His face was pale, his eyes hollow, as though the light of his soul had been extinguished. When the ceremony ended and the coffin was lowered into the ground, he collapsed to his knees, his hands clawing at the dirt. With a keening cry that sent a shiver down my spine, he threw himself atop the coffin, his anguished sobs echoing through the cemetery. "Mother," he whispered, his voice raw. "Why did this happen? Why did you leave me?" The mourners exchanged uneasy glances, their discomfort palpable. My father put a hand on my shoulder and gently guided me away, but I couldn't shake the image of the young man, his grief a raw wound laid bare for all to see. It was only later, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the world was swallowed by the encroaching night, that I learned the truth behind the tragedy. The young man's mother had not succumbed to illness or accident, as many had assumed. Her death was the result of something far darker, an act of malice born from the hands of a witch. The village spoke of her in hushed tones, as though uttering her name might summon her from the shadows. Old Marta, they called her, a crone who lived on the outskirts of town in a ramshackle hut that seemed to sag under the weight of its own malevolence. Rumors of her craft had circulated for years, tales of curses, hexes, and the dark rituals she performed in the dead of night. Few had dared to confront her, and those who had often returned with strange ailments or not at all. It was said that the young man's mother had crossed Marta in some way, though no one could agree on the details. Some claimed she had refused to sell her a piece of land, others whispered that she had insulted Marta in public. Whatever the reason, the witch had exacted her revenge with a ritual as cruel as it was effective. In the dim confines of her hut, Marta had crafted a doll, a crude effigy fashioned from straw, cloth, and scraps of the woman's hair and clothing. By the flickering light of a dozen black candles, she had chanted words of power, her voice a low, guttural rasp that seemed to reverberate in the very air. Then, with a wicked smile, she had taken a long, silver needle and driven it into the doll's chest. The young man's mother had died that same night, clutching her chest as though an invisible hand had reached into her body and torn out her heart. The days that followed the funeral were steeped in unease. The villagers avoided the young man, their pity mingled with fear, as though his grief might be contagious. He retreated into his home, his curtains drawn tight against the world. But I often saw him through the cracks, pacing back and forth like a caged animal, his eyes burning with a mixture of despair and something darker, a hunger for vengeance. One night, as the wind howled through the village, rattling shutters and setting the trees to moaning, I saw him leave his house. Cloaked in black, he moved like a shadow, his steps purposeful. I followed him, my curiosity overriding my fear, and watched as he made his way to Marta's hut. The hut was as I had imagined, a decrepit structure that seemed to exude an aura of dread. The windows were dark, the only light coming from a faint glow that seeped through the cracks in the door. The young man approached, his hands clenched into fists, and pushed the door open. I crept closer, peering through a gap in the wood. Inside, Marta sat hunched over a cauldron, her wiry gray hair spilling over her face like a curtain. The room was cluttered with jars of herbs, animal bones, and strange trinkets that seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy. The young man stood in the doorway, his face a mask of fury. "You killed her," he said, his voice trembling with rage. "You killed my mother." Marta looked up, her eyes gleaming like twin coals. She smiled, a toothless grin that sent a chill down my spine. "And what will you do about it, boy?" she crooned, her voice as oily as a serpent's hiss. "Strike me down. Curse me with your hate. You have no power here." The young man stepped forward, pulling a blade from his cloak. Maybe not, he said, but I can still end you. Before he could strike, Marta raised her hand and muttered a word that seemed to freeze the very air. The young man staggered, the knife falling from his grasp. He clutched his head, his scream piercing the night as he collapsed to the floor. I wanted to run, to flee from the horrors unfolding before me, but my feet refused to move. I watched, rooted in place, as Marta stood over him, her gnarled fingers weaving intricate patterns in the air. A dark mist began to rise from the floor, coiling around the young man like a living thing. His screams grew fainter, his body convulsing as the mist seeped into his skin. When it was over, he lay still, his chest rising and falling with shallow breaths. Marta turned to the door, her eyes meeting mine through the gap. A cruel smile spread across her face. You shouldn't have come here, child, she said, her voice dripping with malice. I turned and ran, the darkness swallowing me as I fled back to the village. My heart thundered in my chest, my mind racing with images of the young man's fate and the witch's malevolent gaze. The young man returned to the village the next day, but he was not the same. His eyes were dull, his movements mechanical, as though he were a puppet being guided by unseen strings. The villagers whispered of possession, of dark magic that had stolen his soul. He wandered the streets aimlessly, his lips moving in silent conversation with no one. One by one, the villagers began to disappear. First the baker, then the blacksmith, then the priest. Each vanished without a trace.